In the town of Millstone, Colorado, nestled between rolling hills and quiet woods, life moved slowly. Everyone knew everyone. The people there were close-knit, traditional, and most of all, they believed in the power of faith. And no one represented that faith more than Pastor Elijah Hart. With his soft-spoken demeanor, kind smile, and the way he quoted scripture with conviction, he had quickly become the heart of the community church. From the elderly to young families, everyone trusted him. He led food drives, organized counseling sessions, and even offered shelter to those in need. On Sundays, the pews overflowed. People didn't just come to pray, they came to hear Elijah. They called him a man of God, but none of them knew who he really was. Elijah's charm wasn't just natural, it was practiced. He had spent years perfecting his new persona. Clean-cut, quiet, and always in control, he carefully crafted a life that looked perfect on the surface. His past was sealed behind a name no one dared question. He had no family in town, no old photos, and no childhood friends. He told people he grew up in a different state, that he'd found God after a troubled youth, and that he had been reborn into the man they saw before them. It was the perfect story, one that no one thought to challenge. After all, he was the one blessing newborns, marrying couples, and comforting the grieving. But hidden behind the sermons and charity was a secret so dark, it had followed Elijah like a shadow for over a decade. His real name was not Elijah Hart, it was Stephen Morris. And years ago, in another state, he had been under investigation for a financial scam that ruined several lives. Instead of facing the law, Stephen vanished. He changed his appearance slightly, took on a new identity, and started fresh in Millstone. No fingerprints, no digital traces, no records that connected the old name to the new one. It was a clean break until someone started looking. Stephen, now Elijah, lived every day with the fear of being found out. He avoided media attention, stayed off social media, and never shared personal stories. Every friendship was kept at a distance. He was warm, but guarded. He smiled, but never too much. He knew that even one crack in the wall could bring everything crashing down, and for years, it worked. No one questioned him. Not the church board, not the police, not even the curious newcomers. Elijah Hart was the perfect citizen, but cracks had started to form. In 2013, his estranged mother somehow found him. She had always been a problem, loud, unpredictable, and incapable of keeping secrets. She had kept quiet during the fraud investigation, but resented him for leaving her behind. When she discovered his new identity, she saw it as her chance to finally get back at him. She didn't want money. She wanted control. She threatened to expose him. That was when Elijah realized how fragile his new life really was. To the public, Elijah's rise as a spiritual leader looked like a divine calling, but to him, it was survival. Every lie he told was another stone in the wall he built around his true self. Every good deed was a mask. He didn't help people out of love. He helped them because their trust was his best protection. If they saw him as holy, they wouldn't dig. If they believed he was righteous, they wouldn't ask questions. But he knew that one wrong move, one person seeing too much, could unravel it all. And as his mother grew louder, he faced a terrible truth. If he wanted to protect his identity, he would have to silence her forever. Margaret Dean lived alone in a modest apartment in Kansas City. Her health was declining, and her social circle had grown smaller over the years. But when she saw a church livestream from a town in Colorado, her weary eyes sharpened with recognition. There, standing at the pulpit, was her son. She hadn't seen him in over a decade, not since the scandal that forced him to vanish, but she knew that face. No beard or glasses could hide it. Stephen Morris was alive and now calling himself Pastor Elijah Hart. Margaret felt a mix of anger and power. Her son had walked away from his old life and left her to deal with questions, debt collectors, and shame. She had been forced to lie to authorities, even pretend she didn't know where he went. And now there he was, giving sermons to smiling churchgoers. She decided it was time to make things right on her terms. She reached out through email first, then a letter, and finally left a voicemail. In each message, her tone became more demanding. She told him she wanted a visit, that she knew everything, and if he didn't come clean, she would. Elijah never responded. But he read the letter carefully. Margaret knew the real name behind the new one. She had access to old family records. She could destroy the careful world he had built brick by brick. And worst of all, she wasn't bluffing. 2 weeks after her last message, Margaret was found dead in her apartment. The front door was kicked in, drawers had been pulled out, and glass was shattered across the floor. But nothing was missing. Her purse sat on the table, jewelry untouched, and cash in the kitchen drawer was still there. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Police believed it was a home invasion gone wrong. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no security footage. What they didn't know was that Elijah had taken a trip that weekend. He had driven a rental car booked under a false name nearly 600 miles, checked into a motel under another alias, and returned before anyone noticed he was gone. The car was returned cleaned, and no digital trace connected the trip to him. The police had no reason to look into a small-town pastor in another state. As far as they were concerned, it was just another unsolved crime in a struggling neighborhood. Elijah returned to Millstone the next Sunday, stepped up to the pulpit, and preached about forgiveness and letting go of anger. The congregation nodded, along, unaware that their trusted pastor had blood on his hands. That day he smiled wider than usual. The threat was gone. No one else knew his past. Margaret had taken the truth to her grave, but there was a detail he hadn't accounted for. The motel owner, an older man with a habit of writing down everything, had kept a handwritten logbook. He noted a guest who looked nervous, paid in cash, and asked too many questions about the local bus routes. That entry sat unnoticed in a dusty drawer for months. And the rental car, though returned clean, had traveled along toll roads with cameras that snapped license plates. The fake ID linked to the booking was never traced, but the pattern had been quietly recorded in a state database. These were details too small to matter now, but they would come back years later when someone finally started asking the right questions. For now, Elijah was safe. His mother's body was buried, the investigation had gone cold, and no one in Millstone suspected a thing. He believed the worst was behind him. What he didn't realize was that removing one threat would only lead to more. Someone else was already watching, and they would be next. Jeremy Fields was a quiet, methodical man who rarely made waves. When he relocated to Millstone in 2017 for a teaching job at the local community college, he didn't expect to reconnect with distant family. But during a casual conversation at the grocery store, someone mentioned the town's beloved pastor Elijah Hart. The name didn't ring a bell, but the description did. Tall, articulate, composed, with piercing eyes and a voice that carried weight. Curious, Jeremy attended a Sunday service. When he saw Elijah at the front of the church, his stomach dropped. He knew that face. It wasn't Elijah Hart, it was Stephen Morris, his older cousin. Jeremy and Stephen had grown up together for a time, bonded by summer visits and family holidays. Though they had drifted apart over the years, Jeremy hadn't forgotten what happened in the early 2000s. Stephen had been involved in a serious financial fraud case, embezzling funds from a nonprofit and laundering money through shell companies. The case fell apart when Stephen disappeared. Family whispers had speculated everything from fleeing the country to changing his name. Now, years later, here he was, leading a congregation and acting like a new man. Jeremy didn't approach him. He kept his distance and began quietly researching on his own. He looked up Stephen's past, pieced together what little he could from old court filings and online archives, and began noting the similarities between the two identities. His instincts told him not to go to the police just yet. There was no proof, just suspicions, memories, and fragments of a past few remembered. Instead, he hired a private investigator to dig deeper. The investigator, a retired detective named Carl Haynes, confirmed what Jeremy feared. The fingerprints were a match, despite a minor alteration. The facial recognition showed a 92% match between Stephen Morris and Elijah Hart. The timelines aligned. Stephen vanished in 2006. Elijah emerged in Millstone in 2007. It was enough to raise alarms, but not enough to guarantee conviction. Jeremy kept everything in a secure file on his laptop, backing up the data on a portable drive. He was planning to compile a full report before going to the authorities. He didn't realize he was already being watched. Elijah had sensed something was off. Jeremy's sudden appearance, his quiet nature, and his habit of attending church sporadically but never engaging raised red flags. Elijah was cautious by nature, and after Margaret's incident, he had become hypersensitive to changes in his environment. He began subtly probing Jeremy, asking mutual acquaintances, checking social media activity, even driving by his house at odd hours. It didn't take long for him to confirm his cousin's suspicions. One evening in late October, Jeremy's car was found parked near the edge of a national park. The keys were in the ignition, and his backpack was in the trunk. For 3 days, search teams combed the area. His body was finally discovered at the bottom of a steep ravine. His death was ruled accidental, a tragic fall during a solo hike. Local authorities found no evidence of foul play, no bruises inconsistent with a fall, no signs of struggle, but something was missing: Jeremy's laptop. His home had been broken into 2 days earlier. Nothing valuable was stolen except the laptop and the backup drive. Police didn't connect the break-in to his death. They assumed it was a separate burglary. No one considered the possibility that the pastor who offered a heartfelt prayer during Jeremy's memorial service might have had anything to do with it. Elijah, once again, had removed the threat. There were no more loose ends, or so he thought. But every time he looked into the crowd during Sunday service, his eyes scanned for another familiar face. Deep down, he knew the past had a way of surfacing, and he could never let his guard down. Dana Caldwell had built a quiet life for herself in Seattle. After her marriage to Stephen Morris collapsed under the weight of financial lies and legal threats, she changed her number, left town, and tried to forget everything. But memories have a way of surfacing when you least expect them. In 2020, while scrolling through a friend's Facebook post about a small-town church in Colorado, she paused. There was a photo of a pastor standing beside a youth group. He was older now, with graying hair and a softer appearance, but the eyes were the same. The name said Elijah Hart, but Dana knew who it was. Stephen Morris, her ex-husband. For days, Dana debated what to do. She had spent years putting that chapter of her life behind her. Stephen had vanished just before charges were filed, leaving her to answer questions from police and face threats from victims who had lost money in his schemes. She had always believed he would resurface, but never like this. Not as a spiritual leader, not standing in front of a cross, preaching about redemption. The hypocrisy lit a fire inside her. She wanted justice. She wanted to confront him and force him to acknowledge what he'd done to her, to others, to himself. Dana traveled to Millstone quietly. She booked a motel under her maiden name and kept a low profile. Her plan was to gather evidence first. She took photos, recorded one of his sermons, and even followed him to his home. She documented everything: his routines, his interactions, his behavior. She confided in a close friend back home, sending copies of the photos and voicemails describing what she planned to do next. "I'm going to face him," she said in one message. "He needs to know he can't hide forever." That message was sent 2 days before Dana's body was found. Her car was discovered near the state line. reduced to a burnt shell. The fire department responded to a report of smoke, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. The blaze had consumed everything. Her ID was found near the driver's seat, charred but still readable. Investigators labeled it a vehicle fire resulting from an engine malfunction. There was no immediate reason to suspect otherwise. The woman had been traveling alone. There were no signs of external damage to the vehicle before the fire. It looked like a tragic accident. What wasn't reported was that Dana's phone had been remotely wiped an hour before the fire. All of her photos, call logs, messages, and recordings were gone. Even her cloud backups had been deleted. Police assumed the data loss occurred during the fire. Only her friend back in Seattle knew she had collected evidence. But when contacted, the friend hesitated. Without hard proof, and with Dana gone, it felt dangerous to speak up. So she stayed quiet. In Millstone, Pastor Elijah Hart took the pulpit the following Sunday as usual. He appeared somber, delivering a sermon on grief, fate, and the mysteries of life. Some said he looked unusually tired. Others thought his voice cracked once during prayer. But by the end of the service, he was back to his calm, composed self. No one knew that just days earlier, he had come face to face with the last person who truly knew who he was. Dana's death closed another chapter. Elijah had once again removed a threat without raising suspicion. But it came at a cost. His paranoia grew. He stopped accepting visitors unannounced. He began watching people more closely, tracking their questions, analyzing their movements. He knew the noose was tightening. And though he had silenced 3 voices from his past, he couldn't silence the one growing in his own mind, the voice that whispered, "Someone else will come." Amy Rowe had a talent for uncovering what others missed. She wasn't a detective or a police officer. She was a journalist. But her instincts were sharp and her curiosity relentless. In 2023, she launched a podcast series focused on small-town pastors with mysterious pasts. It started as a curiosity, but soon became an obsession. During her research, she stumbled upon Pastor Elijah Hart of Millstone, Colorado. On paper, he was flawless, no criminal record, glowing community reviews, and a spotless reputation. But there was something too perfect about him. His history before 2007 was blank, almost as if he hadn't existed before then. Amy began to dig. She searched public records, archived videos, and old news articles. Slowly, inconsistencies began to surface. She discovered that Elijah Hart appeared in Millstone just months after a man named Stephen Morris vanished from Missouri during an active fraud investigation. The facial resemblance between Elijah and Stephen was subtle but undeniable. Amy used AI-enhanced image tools to match features, ran background checks on aliases, and eventually found traces of a paper trail. It wasn't solid proof, but it was enough to raise red flags. She reached out to a federal investigator she had interviewed months earlier for a different case. Together, they began re-examining cold files tied to Elijah's suspected former identity, starting with Margaret Dean's murder in Kansas City. Her case had gone unsolved for years, considered a burglary gone wrong. But upon re-examination, new forensic techniques detected microscopic traces of carpet fibers at the scene that didn't match the victim's apartment. Those fibers closely resembled the type found in the brand of rental car Elijah had used that weekend. Next, they revisited the case of Jeremy Fields. His autopsy had shown deep injuries consistent with the fall, but new analysis of bruising patterns suggested he had been pushed. DNA collected from under his fingernails was minimal, but now, with advanced testing, they found degraded skin cells that matched Elijah Hart. It had never been tested before because Elijah's name hadn't been in any database, but with Stephen Morris now being considered a suspect, the pieces began to align. Dana Caldwell's case was the last piece of the puzzle. Authorities had believed the fire in her car was accidental, but Amy uncovered a small insurance complaint. Dana had filed just a week before her trip, one that referenced her ex-husband and mentioned she was collecting evidence against him. The file had been buried in insurance archives, overlooked during the initial investigation. Investigators returned to the burned vehicle remains and discovered residue of an accelerant near the fuel tank. Combined with the suspicious remote wiping of Donna's phone, it no longer looked like an accident. With mounting evidence, the authorities moved quietly. On a bright spring morning in 2024, federal agents arrived at Millstone Community Church. During a Sunday service, in the middle of a sermon about truth and righteousness, Pastor Elijah Hart was arrested. The congregation sat frozen, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. Their trusted leader, a man they had prayed with, cried with, and admired, was led away in handcuffs. The news spread quickly. As media swarmed Millstone, the truth unfolded publicly. Elijah Hart was indeed Stephen Morris, a fugitive who had changed. His name, committed fraud, and silenced anyone who threatened to expose him. He was charged with 3 counts of murder, identity fraud, and obstruction of justice. In prison, he remained silent, refusing to speak during interviews, maintaining his innocence to anyone who listens. But the evidence is overwhelming, and his trial is expected to be one of the most watched in state history. The people of Millstone still struggle to reconcile the man they knew with the monster now revealed. Behind the sermons, the smiles, and the scripture was a predator hiding in plain sight, one who built his sanctuary on lies and watched it all collapse.